One of the biggest mistakes I see in cloud desktop conversations is people trying to force Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop or AVD into a simple which one is better debate. That's usually the wrong question. Because the reality is these two platforms are designed for different operating models, different cost models, and different levels of control. On the surface, they can look very similar, right? In both cases, you're delivering a Windows desktop from the Microsoft cloud. And in both cases, the user gets a remote desktop experience. And from the end user point of view as well, the difference can sometimes feel quite small. But underneath that, there are very different products. Okay, they're very, very different. One is built around simplicity, predictability, and a more sort of packaged operational model. The other, however, is built around flexibility, control, and the actual ability to optimize for a much wider range of scenarios. So in this video, I want to break this down properly, not from a marketing perspective and not in a way that turns it into some kind of tribal argument, right? But in a way that actually helps you decide where each one fits in your organization, what the trade-offs are, and how to think about them architecturally. The first thing to understand is that Windows 365 and AVD are not really competing in the way people actually assume they are. Yes, they both deliver cloud-based Windows desktop, okay, but they do it through very different design philosophies. I kind of mentioned this earlier. Windows 365 is built to give organizations a cloud PC that is easier to provision and much easier to understand commercially. It simplifies a lot of the infrastructure thinking and pushes you more towards a more standardized per user desktop model. Azure Virtual Desktop, on the other hand, is a broader desktop and application virtualization platform. It gives you more flexibility in how you design a service, how you size it, and how you scale it. And not to mention how to optimize it, right? That means the decision is not really about which one is more modern or which one is more Microsoft. The real decision is about which one aligns better to your users, your operational model, your internal capability, and the level of control you actually need. And to make that decision properly, you have to separate three things, right? First, the architecture, then the cost model, and then the use cases. If you mix those together, the conversation gets muddy very, very quickly. Let's start with the core architectural difference, right? Because this is where the rest of the conversation really comes from. AVD is fundamentally a desktop virtualization platform that runs inside your Azure environment, okay? You're designing and operating the session OS infrastructure that delivers the desktop or app experience, right? Microsoft manages that control plane for the service itself. This is a major advantage, first of all, right? But the actual compute, storage, networking, identity integration, and scaling behavior of that environment still sits within our design responsibility. When I say our, I mean us as the consumer. And what that means is AVD gives you a lot of freedom. Okay, you can choose pooled or personal desktops. You can use multi-session windows where it makes sense as well. You can align host pool designs to workload patterns. You can scale capacity dynamically as well. You can even shape the environment around that user behavior rather than enforcing users into sort of a single model. Windows 365 takes a bit of a different approach. Okay, it's designed more like a cloud PC service. The desktop is dedicated to the user and the overall experience is intended to feel more like assigning a persistent sort of cloud managed workstation rather than designing a sort of virtual desktop platform. That changes the conversation straight away because it means Windows 365 is much more about a standardized personal desktop. And it's much less about building an optimized shared capacity service. That's the first major distinction, right? AVD is usually the more sort of flexible platform, whereas Windows 365 is usually the more sort of opinionated and simplified one. And that matters because simplicity is valuable, but only if it aligns with what your environment actually needs. Cost is usually the first thing that people jump to, right? And it's also the area where the most confusion does happen. People often hear that Windows 365 has sort of this predictable per user pricing and they immediately assume that that means it's more expensive. Or they hear that AVD is consumption based and immediately again they make an assumption that that means it's cheaper. The truth is a bit more nuanced than that. Windows 365 is easier to reason about financially because it is closer to a fixed per sort of user desktop model. You know that if you provision a cloud PC for a user, that user has a desktop with a predictable monthly cost profile. That is very attractive for an organization that values commercial simplicity, stable forecasting, and a service model that behaves more like a user-based endpoint assignment. AVD is different because the cost depends much more heavily on how the environment is designed and operated. You're not just paying for sort of a desktop, right? You're paying for the underlying Azure resource that makes the service work, right? That includes compute, storage, the profile infrastructure, networking, and an identity dependency in your environment. Because of that, AVD can be highly cost efficient when it is designed well. That's the key, right? Especially when you can use pool multi-session capacity effectively. But it can also become inefficient very quickly if density, scaling, or host design are poor. That's why I generally say the cost conversation should not start with which is cheaper. It should actually start with what kind of commercial behavior do you actually want from the platform. If you want cost predictability and user level simplicity, Windows 365 is very attractive. If you want architectural flexibility and the ability to optimize cost through density and scaling, AVD usually gives you the more room to do that. But again, it all depends more from the design and operation side in return. So the trade-offs it's not a simple price. It is predictability versus optimization potential. This is probably the biggest decision point in the whole comparison. Okay, AVD gives you more control, and in many ways that is the greatest strength. You can decide how host pools are structured, how users are sort of distributed, how scaling behaves, how the environments are segmented as well, and how different workloads are delivered. You can lean into pool desktops where shared capacity makes sense, right? Use personal desktops where needed, and shape the platform around the actual business requirement. But the flip side of control is responsibility. More control means you have more design choices, more moving parts, and more operational decisions to get it right. It means you need to think about image management, profile handling, host pool design, right? Scaling strategy, and how the platform will be maintained over time. As Spider-Man said, with more power comes more responsibility. If the organization has the skill set and the appetite for that, AVD can be extremely powerful. If it doesn't, that same flexibility can become a source of complexity. Windows 365 reduces a lot of that complexity, right? Because it gives you a simple operational story. You're not trying to optimize a shared desktop fabric in the same way. You're actually assigning a cloud PC model to users and managing it more like a persistent desktop service. And that means less architectural flexibility, but also less architectural burden. So the real question here is not, do we like control? The real question is, do we actually need the level of control that AVD provides? And are we willing to own what comes with it? That is a much more honest way to evaluate the two platforms. If you like this kind of breakdown, the real architectural trade-offs, not just the surface level product comparison, make sure to hit that subscribe button. This is exactly the kind of Microsoft Cloud content I'm going to keep on building on this channel. A lot of people assume this comparison is mostly about IT operational and costs, but user experience matters as well, and not just in the obvious sense. Windows 365 is often attractive when the organization wants a highly consistent, user-dedicated desktop experience. There's a simplicity to that model that makes it easier to understand. A user gets their cloud PC, it's their environment, and the service behaves in a way that feels familiar to teams that already think in terms of that sort of workstation ownership. Azure Virtual Desktop can absolutely deliver an excellent user experience as well, but the way it does that depends much more on architecture. Right? User experience in AVD is the result of design quality. I've mentioned this a lot in my other videos as well. Okay? If host pools are segmented correctly, profile handling is clean, session density is appropriate, and scaling is aligned to demand, AVD can feel extremely good. But if those layers are poorly designed, user experience becomes inconsistent much faster. So from a decision-making perspective, I'd frame it like this. Windows 365 is usually easier to align to a standardized personal desktop experience. AVD is usually better when you want to shape the experience around multiple workload types and optimize how capacity is delivered. Both can work extremely well. right? The difference is whether you want the service experience to come from sort of simplification or from architecture. This is one of the most important parts of the comparison now, okay? And it's often glossed over annoyingly. AVD gives you the ability to use multi-session windows in a way that fundamentally changes the economic model of the platform, right? That means multiple users can share the same host capacity, which is one of the main reasons AVD can become very cost effective when the workload is right for it. That capability is a huge differentiator because it allows the service to be designed as a shared capacity desktop platform rather than purely as a one user to one desktop model, okay? If your users fit that pattern, the entire conversation shifts, right? You're no longer just thinking about how many desktops do I need? You're actually thinking about how efficiently you can deliver concurrent demand. That doesn't mean multi-session is always the right answer, right? It depends on the applications, the user expectations, the profile behavior, and the consistency of the workload. But when it fits, right, it's one of the strongest strategic advantages AVD actually has. This is also why the comparison often becomes unfair when people just reduce it to cloud PC versus cloud desktop. AVD is not just a way to give people desktops in the cloud. It's a platform that can be optimized in ways that are structurally different from a dedicated per user desktop model. So if the environment has a significant user base that can operate effectively in pooled or multi-session design, that should immediately push AVD much higher in the conversation. Now, with all that said, there are absolutely scenarios where Windows 365 is a much better fit. Okay, if an organization wants to move quickly, simplify desktop delivery, reduce the amount of infrastructure decision making, and provide a persistent cloud PC model to users, Windows 365 becomes very compelling. Okay, it is especially attractive where simplicity and commercial predictability matter more than deep architectural optimization. It also fits well in cases where users generally need dedicated desktops and there isn't a strong business case for building out more sort of flexible virtualization service. If the intention is not to optimize around pool capacity, not to build differential host pool strategies, and not to continuously tune scaling logic, then some of AVD's strongest features may not actually create value for that organization. That's the point of a lot of the teams that I see, in IT miss. More flexibility is not automatically better. If the organization doesn't need it, then operational simplicity of Windows 365 may be more valuable than the optimization potential of AVD. So, Windows 365 tends to make more sense when the priority is speed, simplicity, and standardized personal desktop assignment rather than platform level optimization. AVD tends to make more sense when the organization wants to treat cloud desktops as an architectural problem rather than just a desktop assignment problem. Right? You need a flexibility across those user types. If you want to optimize pool capacity, if your workloads vary significantly, or if you want the ability to control how scaling and density interact with demand, AVD gives you a much more stronger design surface. That becomes especially relevant at larger scale. Okay, once you move beyond small numbers of users and start dealing with different user personas, variable concurrency, and the need to optimize around sort of cost without sacrificing experience, AVD's flexibility becomes much more strategically useful. But the important part is that AVD rewards good design, right? And it punishes weak design. I've said that in loads of videos. The platform does not remove the need for architecture. It amplifies the impact of it. So if the organization has that capability to design and operate properly, AVD often gives you that more sort of long-term strategic control. If not, it can easily become more complex when the business actually wanted in the first place. Okay, so this is where I actually think the conversation gets more useful. For a lot of organizations, the right answer is not Windows 365 or AVD. It's actually Windows 365 and AVD used intentionally for different kinds of users. That hybrid thinking makes a lot of sense. Right? You might use Windows 365 where the business wants consistent, easy to understand cloud PCs for certain types of users, right? Developers is a prime example. And then you can use AVD where you need pooled, scale, cost optimize or more control around how workloads are delivered. More sort of business users like maybe HR or marketing or, day-to-day sort of office users. That is usually a much more mature approach when trying to force one platform into every scenario. Because once you stop treating the comparison like a winner-takes-all fight, the real architecture question becomes very clear. Where do we need simplicity? And then, where do we need flexibility? And where do we get better value of using each platform for what it's actually good at? That is a much better design conversation than just comparing feature lists. If you take one thing away from this video, it should be this. Okay, Windows 365 and AVD are not just two slightly different ways to do the same thing. Okay, they are two different operating models for delivering Windows from the cloud. Windows 365 is generally stronger when you want simplicity, predictability, and more standardized cloud PC approach. AVD is generally stronger when you want flexibility, architectural control, and the ability to optimize how desktops and apps are delivered at scale. Neither one is automatically better, right? The right choice depends on the users, the workload, the internal capability, and the commercial model you actually want. And for a lot of organizations, the best answer won't be one or the other. It'll actually be knowing exactly where each one fits. In the next video, I'm going to go back into sort of the AVD architecture side and actually break down auto-scaling and why it's so important, and how really architects can use that in their design to help optimize and lower costs specifically. Look, if you want me to keep doing these more conversational, practical deep dives, let me know in the comments. I'll keep building my sort of content like that. And also, as always, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support means so much. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.